Hi, and welcome to Guitar Economics Conversation. In this conversation with hand surgeon Mark Phillips, we're going to talk about focal dystonia. Mark Phillips will explain what focal dystonia is, and I will talk about the work that I do with the guitarists who suffer from this condition. Some of the things that I mention in my talk with Mark Phillips is the use of inhibition, delayed continuity, and shadow practicing. And you can find videos about these on my channel if you're interested.
Right, Paul. So I thought we'd talk about musicians' focal dystonia first. Yeah, how does that sound?
That would be great.
Yeah. We've seen quite a few patients, haven't we, with that condition?
We certainly have.
Yeah, it's a really difficult condition, and what are your thoughts about the condition? First of all, I'll tell you then what I think about it.
The guitarists that I have seen have obviously, in many cases, almost been unable to play, and it can have a very, very serious effect on their performance and practice. But it's also clear that in some cases, I think we've been quite lucky with using things like shadow practicing that I talk about in one of my videos, and a lot of mental work that seem to have helped them going back into playing.
Some really great
and some of them have actually been very, very successful. And that's, of course, really promising to see that. But there's no doubt,
an almost impossible condition to cure.
Yeah, this is. I don't ever have seen a guitar player being actually completely cured for it.
Yeah, that's really difficult. And the timeline management, I mean, that we've been doing with people saying, it's going to be a year or 2 years of quite hard work to turn this all around. And the patients that have done well have not done well quickly. It's really hard work, and I think we've got to be realistic about that, haven't you?
I think that's one of the things that makes it difficult for the guitarist, is when they then are told that, do you know what, this could take you a couple of years to get over, and that is, of course, a really tough message to get. Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of research out there on what's been discovered. Catherine Butler's done some amazing work. She's a hand therapist in London. You can Google her, but basically she has done functional MRI, PET scans. The changes in the brain have been established pretty well. There's Professor Mark Edwards down at St. George's has done an amazing amount of neurology work on this. But essentially, treatments are still struggling, and the treatments basically revolve around slow down techniques, mirror therapy, splinting and strapping, Botox, and some medical treatments against spasms, etc. And the reason, in any surgical field, when there's more than one treatment for anything, generally that means that none of them are very good. And when you've got a multifactorial discipline of treatments like that, you're really you're struggling, basically. But I mean, that's the approach generally. And I think the reason it's so difficult is because it's not. This is my view now. After all the reading I've done, my view of what I think musicians' focal dystonia is this. I don't think it's a mechanical problem. I think it's a software problem in the brain. And because I am a keen amateur trumpet player and I've had to learn licks and scales and things, I now know that I can play those things without even thinking about them. You could be even thinking about something else. And what musicians call muscle memory is where a whole run of stuff happens when you just instigate it in your mind. And I think the problem with musicians' focal dystonia comes about when something interferes with that and an abnormal pathway is laid down. And then there's nothing the musician can do, because the more they try to do that, the more it reinforces all of those bad synaptic pathways that become strengthened. And usually, the longer it's been going on, the more difficult it is to treat, because those automatic pathways, those muscle memory pathways, have now been strongly established, and they strongly they entrench because they are part of an attempt by the brain to work around the problem that the brain perceives as is happening. And I think a lot of musicians' focal dystonia is a secondary phenomenon. So if you have somebody who has an injury, you maybe have a tendonitis, and then they will find that their finger doesn't do what they want it to do in the normal time frame, their brain will try to overcome that by sending other signals. And then when the condition then resolves, the brain is exaggerating the message that it's sending to the finger. And because the tolerances are so subtle for musicians, then everything goes haywire, and a whole load of bad software is released, and the code is all scrambled, and the finger does something completely unexpected, beyond the person's control. It's horrible to watch, isn't it, Paul?
Yes, it is. It's so sad to see when you see a guitar player with that kind of problem. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about is actually the idea of doing as much mental practice away from the instrument. So, for example, particularly if you get a new piece of music, you should not grab the guitar as your first port of call, so to speak. You should learn the piece as much as you can by visualization at a very slow manner. And I've got a video where I demonstrate how that works. And I am wondering whether, because we're talking about cure, but if we can prevent it in the first place, that would obviously be much better. And I'm really wondering whether that is a way forward for musicians to do as much work away from the instrument, but thinking through the right movement and that sort of programming phase, and then go in on the instrument once you've done that, and therefore also cut down in practice time.
Well, interesting you should say that. I'm currently supervising a PhD at Trinity Laban, who's somebody who's just started doing a PhD on the prevention of musicians' vocal dystonia, because there's very little written about it. I had that amazing case, I think, a couple of times in clinic now. I've actually asked people who play piano who have musicians' vocal dystonia, or MFD, to pretend they're playing piano on the clinic desk, and they'll come to the desk, and actually, if they don't imagine they're at a piano, they can play quite well compared to when we move over to a piano in the BAPAM clinic, for example. We can move from the desk where they can move their fingers relatively normally over to the piano, and as soon as they sit in front of the piano, the curling finger will appear again. And it's that strength of association by what somebody is about to do that brings the thing on. It's not psychological. It's a very real. It's a real motor response in response to an onset of a signal that the brain creates. I'm about to do a certain thing. You initiate it, and completely the wrong thing happens. And then often what happens, you see a finger curls up, and then the next finger will go up into hyperextension or something like that, or there'll be a spasm in the wrist. And there's nothing the person can do about that. But actually, away from the instrument, those things don't happen. And as you say, you're doing your mental practice, I think, is really important. Perhaps mimicking those actions and doing them somewhere else away from the guitar is a good way forward. But it's about breaking down that relationship between what you've always done and what now happens in response to that command from your brain, and stopping that abnormal pathway getting any stronger. And I think prevention and picking up early cases is going to be key to that. I think detection of really early cases is really important.
Yeah, and I think the two things that comes to mind there is, obviously we talked about cutting down the practice time, but that when you are practicing, whether it's away from the instrument or with the instrument, you must have full awareness. You must really be aware of listening, sensing and feeling, and of the feedback that you get from your body. And when something goes wrong, use inhibition. Stop yourself, put the instrument down, even do some stretches or whatever, or move away from the instrument, and then think, where is it I'm going? What is it I'm doing? Is this the right way forward? If I'm making these mistakes, certainly I shouldn't be just, well, let's try again and see if it works this time, because in many cases it doesn't. And then you are laying down a pattern that is often faulty and wrong in your practice and in your playing. So I think that's other things that are really, really important to be aware of, how to practice properly.
Yeah, relaying down a new pathway is going to take a long time. And I think both of us, when we've been seeing patients with this together, we've been trying to get people to understand that that's a really long timeline. And otherwise they are going to be left with this condition in the long term. There's just no getting around it. There isn't a surgical treatment, and there is no current medical treatment that's going to deal with it. It's a technique workaround problem. Yeah, and therapists are very used to seeing it, actually.
And I think certainly with guitarists, we can sometimes get obsessed with our practicing, and just practicing, go on and on and on, and sitting for hours playing scales or a particular solo that we want to learn or imitate or whatever, instead of just trusting that actually if I've done it once, then maybe it's better now to take a break and then come back to it in a couple of minutes time, instead of this constant repetitive. Because as also John Williams has mentioned, is that certainly on classical guitar, a lot of the movements are actually unnatural.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, well, I think you don't have to be a musician for very long. I mean, to work out that if you are practicing something and it's going horribly wrong, the more intensely you practice it and the more you focus on it, you're not going to get it right that way. It's about backing off, giving it a rest, maybe sleeping on it, coming back to it the next day, and having a fresh approach, doing it slowly. And everybody knows that speed comes from slowing down your practice and doing it more carefully, methodically. Yeah. So I think that's one of the routes around it.
Yeah, and I think the other one that I use a lot is, of course, the principle of delayed continuity. When there's something you cannot play just before that place that you're unable to master at the moment, you insert the bar, say, of 4 beats of rest.
Yes, I've seen you doing that. It's a very interesting exercise.
Yeah. And it's a fast way of learning something that's really, and I think the most important thing for me is that I can measure it, because I always say, if you can't measure your practicing, you can't control it.
Yeah, and you call that delayed continuity. Yeah.
Delayed continuity, yeah.
That's good. Yeah, it works really well.
Yeah.